these are two really important questions for me that I ask very often in my work as a writer and a researcher and as a woman. Where am I? What is the ecology of the place I find myself in? Who are the trees and the birds and the mammals who live here, the rocks that shape this place? Who are the ancestral people of this place, whose ancestors are in the ground here? And how do my ancestors relate to that, right? And I think that these questions, through my research, are central questions. So this question of place and ancestry, right? The land and the dead, they seem to be central pieces of feminine oracular practice as I have encountered it, particularly in the ancient Mediterranean. And I think that what we're going to look at today from historical examples in the written record, as well as the material record before in Minoan Crete, where the language isn't translated, I think that they speak to a lineage that moves much further back in Europe through the Neolithic and the Paleolithic. And I see what these women are carrying that we're gonna look into. I see in them a feminine way of connecting to place and to the land. These questions of who are the family of beings where I find myself? How do I relate to them? How can I speak to this place and hear it speak back to me? And I think that these kinds of queries are central to understanding a way of standing in power that is surrender to earth, surrender to the voice of the earth, and to an intimacy with place, a relational, full-bodied listening that helps situate us and situate a community within a web of more than human kin. So this is the kind of oracular practice and power that I'm interested in. So I want to also just offer some definitions here. It's like, when I look up oracle, what does this actually mean when I look it up in the dictionary? What are we commonly agreeing upon that this means? So what I read, this was interesting. An oracle, by definition, is a priest or priestess acting as a medium through whom advice or prophecy was sought from the gods in classical antiquity. So already this is very Eurocentric and pretty much classical Greece centric, right? Like oracles only exist in classical Greece, apparently. And it's also very much biased towards gods as opposed to nature spirits, as opposed to ancestors. We're talking about gods in classical antiquity are anthropomorphic, they're humans. When I looked up seer, I got someone who is supposed to be able through supernatural insight to see what the future holds. And then a sibyl, which comes from the Greek sibylla, a woman in ancient times supposed to utter the oracles and prophecies of a god. So in all of these definitions, we see this like orientation toward the supernatural, something outside of nature, something outside of the body, and oriented toward a deity who is conceived of as, it's, you know, it sounds to me male and beyond, right? But I think of, when I think of oracular practice, I think of it more as an intensive communion with a place that allows species boundaries of communication to dissolve and humans to speak back and forth with the more than human world. So not necessarily this power to see the future, but this power to surrender to the present, to hold and hear all of the threads that are here. I'm interested in oracles as ecological knowledge keepers, right? Once we're listening to the earth around us, not to distant, disembodied deities. So let me give you an example of kind of what I mean by that here in California, what that kind of ecological knowledge might look like. And I'm just helping, I'm setting the stage here for where we're going to go. So one way I like to think about this is this beautiful example that I remember learning in my apprenticeship to the art and science of animal tracking. And here in California, when the Swainson's thrushes, these beautiful birds with this like very melodic song, when they arrive, we say that the arrival of the Swainson's thrush kind of signals that the salmon berries are going to be ripe. Or alternately, when we see that the salmon berries are ripe, the Swainson's thrush, soon you're going to hear that sound, that beautiful song. So this is an orientation to relationship and landscape, that the earth is speaking in a multiplicity of relationships all around us all the time, and that these comprise the kind of knowledge base that I think feminine oracular practice was based on in the ancient world. So instead of, seeing an owl or a coyote or a hawk and saying, what does that coyote mean for me? What does that symbolize? Wow, a coyote crossed my path. What does that mean in my life? A more interesting question, first question to me is, wow, who is that coyote? What is that coyote eating right now? What does this season mean for coyote right now? What does life on the land look like right now for this coyote? Is it mating season? Or, when I hear the owl, how does that owl's call change in the forest as the moon changes, right? And I think when we establish this kind of specific relationship to beings in a place, maybe then we can ask those questions, what does it mean for me? But I think first we need to ask, what does it mean for the whole community of beings here beyond the human? So the other famous oracle that I want to talk about is Dodona. So Dodona is located further north in Greece, in Epirus on the mainland. And it's described as one of the oldest oracles in ancient Greece. And again, I think that these oracles, that there are sites like this all across Greece and all over Europe. These are the ones that just became famous in the classical era. And Dodona was said to have been founded by one story by dove priestesses who came from Libya. And it was centered around the worship of an oak tree, a sacred oak that was consecrated to the goddess Dione, who's a very, very old earth goddess, and then later to Zeus, naturally. And it's written that the priestesses and priests who tended this tree sanctuary and received oracles from it, received those oracles through the rustling sounds that the tree leaves made. So they were actually listening to the tree communicating to them as the source of their oracles. So in one example, right, we have the cave and the python and the snake speaking Earth's voice. And in this other example, we have the tree through the rustling of the leaves speaking Earth's voice to the oracle there. And this Dodona reminds me of the Sibyl of Cumae, who we met at the beginning, who did prophecy and speak her visions by entering a cave that led to the underworld. But she wrote those prophecies on oak leaves that she then laid on the ground. And if the wind moved them, she didn't move them back. So she was speaking through cave, through leaf, and through wind all at once, right? Just show you a big oak from Crete here, just so we have the feeling of this communication with the trees that's happening. And for the priestesses and priests of Dodona, it's documented that they slept only on the earth, on the bare earth. They never wore shoes, and they never washed their feet. It's one of my favorite parts. They never washed their feet. They weren't allowed to wash their feet. So their feet are always dirty. They're always covered in earth. And I have this image of like roots or mycelial threads almost starting to sprout from their feet, right? And kind of plug them in to the oak tree. Like they were in almost a sense of a symbiotic relationship with the tree. They're plugged into that degree, sleeping with their head on the earth beneath it, with their feet touching the earth beneath it in order to receive counsel. And when you receive counsel this way, right, this isn't, the trees, I don't think, are primarily talking about kings and wars, and the outcomes of battles, and will I conquer the known world, right? The questions, the big questions that powerful men came to oracles in the classical Greek period to ask questions about. And, you know, as we saw from this image of what the remains of Dodona look like now, and as we saw with Delphi too, the classical iterations or manifestations of these oracles are really divorced from the original myth with the cave and with the oak tree. So suddenly an amphitheater is very far from that embodied, feet covered in dirt oracle that would have been happening at the beginning at a time when I think the kind of more matrilineal, matriarchal, and feminine consciousness of old Europe was still more respected in these oracular places. You know, the oracles that I imagine uttered from the original priestesses and priests of Dodona would have been more akin to ecosystem communication. Like, what does the tree know? The tree knows about cycles of rain, of drought. The tree shows the health of the land in its branches and in its leaves, in the birds who come and go, in the nuts or fruits and their abundance or their lack. The trees know many things that their roots know, and that the mycelium connected to their roots know, connecting them to other trees that can, as we know, like extend very, very far. Oh my goodness, why does it keep doing that? I'm sorry. So I just am feeling into and wanting us to feel into, like, what do decisions for a community that an oracle offers that come from this kind of place, you know, from people who have devoted their entire bodies and senses to the movements of an oak tree, or to the expressions and utterances of the earth at a tectonic spot, or just in the depths of a cave. How different does that look than forced oracles? I mean, you know, and it begs the question, what is the point of oracular work? You know, under patriarchy, as we're seeing it with Apollo, as we're seeing it with Alexander the Great, it seems like the oracle serves the needs of the state. It's an imposing of our will on the earth through the bodies of these women. But under matrilineal or feminine consciousness, the oracle seems to serve the needs of the earth and the whole community. And so the point is healing of individual people, yes, but also collective situations. And the point is to remain in balance with Earth's forces, with seasons, and with a multiplicity of beings that we are interconnected to, and upon whom we absolutely rely for survival. So I'm wanting to point us back to this image from that oak tree, to this image from Minoan Crete, where we see ecstatic communion and communication and what looks like love between humans and trees, right? Humans and earth, this kind of listening, full-bodied listening that situates us within this much bigger network of beings with whom we are not in a hierarchy with, but in a web with, right? This is another seal stone from Minoan Crete, from the west of Crete. And I think this image encapsulates what we've been doing a whirlwind exploration of really beautifully. So we see this image of a woman seated, reaching out her hand in kind of tenderness and connection to this creature that may be a dog, a wild dog. So to me, this is an image of power, not power over, not the power of battles and kings, or even of necessarily securing like security for a community, but rather the power of communion, of listening, of reading Earth's patterns in ways that benefit the whole community and the whole body. To me, power is the one who sits under the oak in stillness and humility long enough to recognize the minute patterns of leaves changing, different birds coming and going, wind and drought and sun and rain. This kind of seeing is a weaving. It's an act of creativity, of devotion, and of love, of prayer. So the final question, oops, no, not yet. The final question that I want to just close with, is kind of bringing this back home to us. So what does this mean for us as women now? What does it mean for each of us to sit down right where we are and listen and learn? I think I'm going to just sit there while I say this, and then we'll read that quote. What is it to sit like spinners and like weavers, gathering bit by bit the knowledge of place that makes us come back home to it, to know what it is saying when we listen, and not just what we want it to say, like not like Alexander the Great forcing speech, but what does it really mean to sit down on the earth and gather what we hear? What does it mean to have our hands be part of a much greater weaving?